Chapter 12, 1969, The Ranch. As we became, and have always become what is around us, the ranch gave us texture. The sharp rocks and smooth stones, the sticks and grasses beneath our bare feet, the hoot of an owl, even the distant scent of a skunk, all added dimension to our experience. The sun heated the mountain boulders above us by mid-morning, and rattlesnakes lay between them. And the deep, cooler places along the creek, beneath thick-trunked oaks, were shade and dark, moist dirt that felt and smelled good, but also insects, spiders, and poison oak to keep us aware. The medicinal scent of eucalyptus trees cut through the summer humidity, and their rattling signaled a welcome breeze to otherwise sweltering afternoons. The 5 girls spending that summer 500 miles north in jail had gotten so hot that they just quit wearing clothes. They were the only prisoners in the women's section, and all of their keepers were women. But Charlie's parole officer in San Francisco read a newspaper article about their nudin, the reporter exclaiming that their cooling tactic was a new kind of protest movement. Friends who had visited them stopped by the ranch to tell us that they had lost weight but looked great. That Patricia was now an exuberant Katie, whose song and humor filled the cell block, and that, while facetiously called a little crazy, they were well regarded by jailers and townsfolk alike. I was struck by the irony that the celebrative spirit was about a stint in the county jail. The rest of us were spending nights in the jailhouse. Temporary arrangements had been made with the ranch's owner for us to bed down on the movie set in the rooms with the black wooden bars. Then somebody brought the black bus back so that we could sleep in it. A quarter mile from the ranch front, the back ranch house or farmhouse was still occupied by hippies who gave us use of their kitchen, so there was some intermingling and exchanges, including a quantity of grass and acid. One day, a group of us was enjoying a walk down the road when I heard Charlie say, "Wasn't Snake wearing that blouse today?" Illogically, I knew that he was talking to me. Snake hadn't been wearing my blouse, but I understood that she was not among us. "No," I said, "but she could be." I wheeled and ran back to the bus. Diane had been regressing. She was more of a child than when we had met her, but I hadn't realized that Charlie thought we needed to keep an eye on her. I found her inside the bus, sitting propped against one wall like a big blow-up doll, being manhandled by an unwholesome hippie known as Rat Face. She appeared to be in a stupor. Had it been anyone else, I would have apologized for the intrusion, but I blurted something about our walk and told Snake to come. Ratface was incensed, but he knew I wasn't going with her, so we left the bus. Snake wasn't herself. She looked bloated. "What are you doing?" I asked her. "I don't know," she said, beginning to cry. "I feel like a dope." "You're not a dope," I said, wondering where she got the idea, and we went down the road. That night, Snake's parents stopped by the ranch. They were living across town at the hog farm with other hippies, and their infrequent visits were welcome, but always surprising. Telephones were rare to the disestablished. Nobody called ahead unless by telepathy. Snake's mother was pretty like her, but heavier. Cheerfully stepping into our bus, the first thing she said to her daughter was, "Hi, dope." Snake reflexively gave her mother a dopey little grin, then suddenly shot me a look to confirm her understanding. LSD was cathartic. Our trips into other lives and lifetimes were awful and fantastic, but always interesting. Egos became visible not just as ideas, but as physical beings, often in the forms of our parents and grandparents whose genes and thoughts we carried. In the extreme, they might appear narcissistic, timid, stubborn, or arrogant, dripping off of us or plastered on like armor. They might be racing toward winning a perpetual competition or hanging back to avoid failure. Whatever the facade, these living sets of habit and thought blocked a soul we knew to be infinitely brighter. Most of us had glimpsed that soul and wanted to let it live in us. The want, paradoxically, was part of the ego that we had to give up. Eventually, we gave the black bus to the hippies so that they could follow their dream to Oregon, and we could move into the farmhouse, paying the proprietor beside the movie set $40 a month for the rent of it. I wandered up the road one day to meet him. George Spahn's house was a crude and cruddy bungalow with a row of filthy windows set to overlook the front yard, and flies going in and out the open door. Beyond the steps and the storm door, I looked into a long, cluttered room with linoleum curling on an unvarnished hardwood floor. Mid-room, with his back to the opposite wall, an old man wearing a light cowboy hat and dark glasses sat in a saloon chair with arm rails, the kind movie cowboys use when playing poker. He was smooth-faced and, despite the heat, dressed in a starched white shirt, suspenders, and gray work pants. Across from him, two ranch hands ate lunch at a table covered in red and white oilcloth. In front of me were several old desks heaped with broken leather, bridles, and harnesses, and sitting on one of them, a gangly, long-nosed, pit-faced cowboy, clothed hat to boots in dusty black. One of his black-gloved hands didn't seem to have any life in it, but he used the wrist of that hand to prop a plate against his chest, while the other hand forked short, greasy plugs of fried hot dog between his chomping jaws. After staring at me, he put down the plate, pulled a flask from his pocket, popped the top of his teeth, and took a swig before yelling, "What the hell do you want?" and laughing fiendishly at my surprise. "Hello?" The old man spoke, as if searching the air with sound waves. "Hello, Mr. Spahn?" I answered. But another cowboy, a short, dirty blonde behind the counter in the kitchen, was rattling pots and pans and yelling, "God damn it, I can't find a damn thing around here." "Hush, hush now," the old man spat out, wincing with irritation. His voice settled when he asked, "Who's there? Is somebody there?" It was as though no one had heard him. I walked towards him, past a balding stuffed chair, and said loudly, "Yes, I'm from down the road at the back." "Here at our place?" he asked, still flinching at the noise. "Mm-hmm. Yeah." "You're one of the ones who rented the farmhouse." "Right. My name's Lynn." One of his big hands extended, and I took it. He nodded straight ahead and told me he was pleased to meet me. He had a solid speaking voice and proper manners, but he didn't seem pleased. "I thought maybe you were one of our riders," he said. "We run a horse rental business here, you know." He shook his head once and complained to himself. Some days you'd never know it. He felt the seat of the chair beside him, and with a twinge of disgust or regret, he said, "Excuse me, I'm blind as a bat." Then he offered me the seat. I sat down and was taken in by the action of the cowboys. They shouted back and forth through the room, though the room was only about 14 feet wide and twice as long. A counter set apart the kitchen, which was greasy and full of flies. Scattered aluminum cake pans at its entrance contained water and a few pieces of dry dog food. The two men sitting at the table got up, dusting crumbs off their hands, stuck their plates and forks on top of a pile of others in the kitchen sink, and continued their conversation out the door. Someone had dropped a chunk of hot dog on the table, and a cat in one of the chairs was reaching a paw to steal it. "Now, Randy," the old man said firmly, about to give instruction, but the darkly dressed cowboy with the gimp hand growled, "Larry, did you do what I told you?" The short blonde Larry came out of the kitchen, flaunting a fist and pouting, "Oh, shut up. You don't tell me what to do." And he took a swat at the cat. Randy pretended to laugh loudly, and the old man wiped his sweating brow with a handkerchief, his bold jaw set in anger. Then a pint-sized red lady with gnarled hands appeared in the doorway. Her face flushed with heat. Dyed red hair, 1940s styled, bulged above her forehead from under a scarf tied at the back of her neck. She had a sharp nose, wore faded red lipstick, and was scowling like a bird. Her words were short in one raucous tone. "What are you doing?" Slack jeans and a snug cowgirl shirt showed her petite but aged body. 5 feet of embittered beauty, with movements like a speedy chicken. Hurrying past me, she gave a curt, professional howdy-do, slid the dog pans aside with one barely shod bunion, and seemed to scare the dirty blonde Larry out of the kitchen. "Pearl?" the old man asked. She didn't answer because she was drinking a glass of water. "Yeah, it's me," she said, coming up for air. There was an undercurrent of resentment. "Riders, Pearl?" he asked impatiently, like they would need his immediate attention. No riders," she obliged, turning around with her second glass of water and delicately blotting the sweat from her forehead with the back of her cuff. "We haven't unsaddled from the last group. I had to come up here to see what was going on." "We're eating. That's what's going on." Randy dared a battle. She countered firmly. "Well, I told you to get those horses unsaddled before you came up here to eat." Before George could finish asking, Pearl told him that the horses were not lathered. "It was a slow group," she said. "They walked most of the way." Still, he looked stricken with worry that compounded his anger. He asked what time it was, but nobody answered. Pearl hurried out the door, sharply telling the cowboys not to dilly-dally, and they got into a play fight, throwing something back and forth at each other. The old man asked again about the time, so I scanned the room and finally asked him where a clock was. He told me that behind me to the right was the door to his bedroom and an alarm clock on his dresser. I opened the door to an odd, sunny room, the windows without curtains. His bed was made and covered with a clean cotton quilt. It was lofty, with old-fashioned posts at its head and foot. The only other pieces of furniture were a bedstand and a dresser, on which were the ticking alarm clock, a telephone, and a bottle of shaving lotion. To one side of the room, a storage space contained 2 or 3 fancy saddles on pegs, and near the door, a cold water faucet crooked over a half-gallon can. He had no hot water and no sink, just a hole in the floor. I could see dirt 2 feet below. "Did you find it?" he sounded. I think to draw me out before I'd invaded too deeply. I closed the door behind me and reported to him the exact time, as I reseated myself beside him. I knew then that he had little left but time. I didn't know that he kept himself busy, thinking about how much money and the rental business was pulling in, versus the cost of feed for horses and cowboys, or that he'd worked himself blind. He had a number of problems, 2 being that he couldn't take care of all the problems he thought of, and people had quit listening to him. I was impressed with George Spahn's hardiness. He was 80 years old, although his blindness had for 5 or 6 years kept him in a world apart. But he was mentally still present, living alone and working through all the frustrations of having lost authority and the running of his own business. I couldn't help but listen to him, and he gave me one of his problems. I took it to everyone at the ranch. There was a tractor-trailer-sized water tank on its side down a steep ravine in a creek bed. George figured that if we could haul that out of there, he could probably get $180 for it. That he was sure it looked an eyesore on his property. I had thought that together we all could move it, but the tank was rusted, had holes in it, and had filled with silt. Not the picture George had in mind. Nobody wanted to even try. I explained that to him, and it made him angry. What with all the people roaming around, there must be some able-bodied man. Christ, he'd do it himself if he could see. What was the matter with people today? I told him it would take a crane to haul it out, and that the crane would cost more to rent than he could get for the tank. I also told him that trees had grown up and now concealed the tank from public view. The full truth was that the rest of his ranch fit quite well with the rusty old water tank. Snake came up the road and sat with George. Ruth and Brenda and the other girls came, and soon the water tank lost prominence in George's mind. He had visitors to entertain. I walked into his house as he was telling stories about old times, and in a brisk Irish brogue he said, "Top of the morning to ya." He was smiling like a new man. Much of Los Angeles was unpaved when George Spahn came to California from Pennsylvania. He bought land and built this ranch. It was one of several movie ranches in California, and the people from Hollywood rented it and his horses regularly. He told of Tom Mix, Gene Autry, and other movie heroes for whom he had wrangled. Autry, he said, was a scoundrel. Most of his fans never knew it. He was mean to the hands and often came to work so drunk he could hardly get him on a horse. You could tell a lot about a man by the way he treats his help. Some fellas were real gentlemen. And then there were the other kind. We would always know when George Spahn disapproved of someone. He'd stop short and substitute gravely. My mother always told me If you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything at all. The 5-room back ranch house was unevenly built, but the hand-hauled stones gave it rare distinction. George Spahn called it the Farmhouse. A modern bathroom that had been plumbed but never connected, so we employed the bucket method again. We furnished and decorated to our liking, but no matter how often we swept, fine sand crept into the house, along with a few cats, dogs, and even people. There were usually a few well-meaning, self-depreciating girls like Shirley coming and going. If, when Shirley served you a meal, you said, looks good, Shirley confided that she had burned the rice, put too much oregano in it trying to cover the burnt taste, and then made it soggy trying to wash off the oregano. If you took that with good humor, she became serious. You really hadn't understood. With tonguey grimaces and guttural sounds, Shirley confessed what she hadn't washed or had dropped on the floor. Until you put down the plate, lest a morsel fill you with her negativity. Then, eyes wandering, Shirley went away. Beau was an excellent cook who came and went frequently. Petite and pale, with round dark eyes and dark frizzled hair, Beau seemed a shrinking violet, but she was something else. Charlie called her a witch. I had never met Beau when we nearly bumped into each other one night on the movie set. I stepped back with a startled hello, but she moved closer, taking one of my braids in her small hand. She yanked it, hard. Calmly, her black eyes studied my surprise, and what I perceived as smugness turned into a bemused but warm smile. Although she said nothing, I felt afterward that Beau liked me. Beau proved less predictable than a wildcat, which she sometimes resembled, bristling and yowling her displeasure. She both craved and hated attention, as she was into fighting with men. She'd been in a physically combative relationship with a hippie man at the farmhouse, but Charlie drew her out of it, and when the hippies left for Oregon, she stayed, silently moving to be near him, always in the shadows. Dennis in Pacific Palisades said that he missed us. We visited but didn't stay. Ranch life was rough but active, with interesting characters and plenty of day traffic. Despite his run-down surroundings, George Spahn was always dressed for business. He bathed from a washbowl of cold, soapy water every morning and shaved with a blade. He couldn't stand even the thought of a beard he could feel. Then he put on clean underclothes, gray work pants, and a starched white shirt, and came out of his bathroom to sit in his chair for most of the day. On the days we stopped in to see him, we began cleaning his house, starting with the antique gas stove in his kitchen. It was so thick with grease it could barely be recognized. There was a modern refrigerator, filthy with fingerprints, and 2 sinks of crusted dishes, pans, and cast iron skillets. Frustrated, he told me, "It's hard to manage a place you can't even see." I told him we fixed up the farmhouse, and that Brenda was cleaning his kitchen, top to bottom. He solemnly said, "I know it. She's a hard worker, good little gal." I could tell by his tone that, to him, the term hard worker was high praise. George eventually allowed us to give him his meals, but he was very particular, feeling each plate by habit before we served the food. Almost everything at first had to come from a can. He told me that he used to have to feel his way around the kitchen, which caused him to lose his appetite. And that there were times when he'd spent half an hour looking for a can opener before giving up and eating dry bread. He said that Pearl fed him, but not always when and what he wanted, and that she was always in a hurry and didn't like to argue. It made him mad just talking about it. Ruby Pearl climbed into her dented green pickup every morning and drove from the valley to run the horse rental business. Tough and shrewd, she supervised all the horses, all the cowboys, and all the money. At evening, she took George into the valley for dinner at one of several hometown restaurants, and then shopping for a lot of coffee, hot dogs, pork and beans, potatoes, eggs, and cinnamon rolls. They'd been doing this for years and knew each other well. The cowboys, for their work, earned little more than a bunk in the food and cigarettes that Pearl purchased with George's money. They were in an odd set, Randy Starr being prominent as the bossiest and most cantankerous, and the others simple down-and-outers, some who had found their roles at the ranch years before and stayed. After the day's hard work, and that could be any day, Brenda sat on the steps of George's house wearing a serious expression. Then she turned her chin up to the sun and she shined. Brenda had hair the colors of driftwood and sea gray eyes behind long lashes. She was younger than most of us, but raised to be confident. Whether delivering babies, fashioning clothes, or driving Mack trucks, Brenda displayed the same calm confidence. As she was a giver, always doing something for somebody else. She was so endearing, able, and attractive that all of the guys wanted to be with her, and many of the girls just wanted to be her. It was the modesty with which she handled this that sustained it. One day, Brenda was ahead of 4 or 5 of us girls, climbing onto a loading dock behind an upscale supermarket. She had just lowered herself from the ledge of the dock into one of the vegetable dumpsters when a little produce man burst through the market's swinging back doors, carrying a big box of outer green cabbage leaves. At the edge of the dock, he looked down, saw Brenda, and stopped. Then he spotted the rest of us and pointedly emptied the box on her head. I remember it in slow motion, the green cascade and her disappearance. When most of the leaves had fallen away, her small face reappeared, blinking up at the man under an elfin cap of curled cabbage leaves. After a stunned silence, the rest of us broke up laughing. "Why don't you get jobs like the rest of us?" the man growled, marching his anger inside. His unhappiness was our answer to that. It wasn't the first or the last time we would be rebuffed. But there were then, and always would be, market employees who became our allies, putting food they were bound to throw away in boxes and bags for us. We would have a dairy connection, a fruit and vegetable man, a baker, and others with whom we might exchange words once or talk to each time we came. And in some cases, as camaraderie became food, food became information, and information camaraderie in circles like that. When the ranch creek was deep enough, we submerged ourselves in it. During hot summers, we sat beside it, cooling our feet, the small colored stones on its bottom making mosaics of our reflections. But rather than soap up the creek, we bathed in the shower shack near George's house. The shower shack reminded me of my grandparents' pump house. It was dark on entering. We could barely see the spigots over the big iron sink. Behind a wood partition, a bare pipe trickled cold water. If several of us girls were in there together, we sat on the bench below nails that held our clothes and took turns soaping and rinsing. In dark wood and dim light, we looked mysterious and beautiful. Shafts of sunlight streaked between the boards, across part of a foot, an elbow, a breast, an eye, a strip of shiny paper. Sometimes we carried pots of heated water from George's kitchen and poured the warm water slowly over each other's heads, knowing the meaning of luxury. At the end of each day, we gathered in the back ranch house next to the stone fireplace. There was noise until everyone settled down on the rug. Then it was rare if we had more than one conversation going across the table. We didn't have a table, but there was a level of respect above which we passed the bowls and plates. Since we ate only one large meal together at sundown, most of us were hungry. The food was good, and the only sounds were in response. The house had space for all of us to sleep together in a long room with a secret door. A stranger standing in the front room might never know it was there. Some people paired off to make love. Paul was a young go-getter. I think Charlie liked that about him. He was a good match for the younger girls, but half a dozen women always awaited Charlie's touch, and every so often he took his time, laying us out like delicacies to be savored. He was also genuinely instructive to the other guys. One night in Dennis Wilson's bedroom, as all of us lay naked on the white rugs beside the fire, Paul was mechanically rubbing Brenda's leg, and Charlie put a hand on Paul's arm. "Easy," he said. "This isn't a piece of furniture. It's a work of art." The rumor of that congregation would travel as the orgy. When it began, Dennis was in our midst, but some of his friends and band members were just sitting on his bed, watching us. As the caressing became more intimate and the sighs more intense, I was half conscious of murmurs and snickering coming from the bed. When Charlie sat up and said to the spectators, "This isn't a joke. Have some respect. Get in or get out." 3 or 4 men jostled each other out of the room, but one took off his clothes and joined us. I didn't know his name until years later, when in prison I saw him on television, receiving a music industry Grammy for having written "I Write the Songs," which had been deemed Song of the Year. We were always more women than men, and some of the men were still in their teens. But a few, like Bobby and Dennis, came and went, hurried by fate or fortune, and Charlie was inclined to spend time with them. His prosecutors would argue that he was recruiting followers, but his inclination toward the company of more experienced, independent men doesn't support that contention. People of the day were calling brothers and sisters to stand up for causes. Each kind of people gathered with and for their own. Ever since we had become a group of women plus Charlie, he had been seeking his brethren. Charles Watson was sitting in Dennis's living room when we stopped by to visit. He reminded me of a tall sapling as he stood and called me ma'am. I thought if he'd had a cowboy hat, he would have tipped it. I came to see this Hollywood I've always heard about, he said, grinning. No doubt he was keen. He'd come from rural Texas, seeking worldly experience on the fast track. While taking business courses at Cal State, he'd worked part-time as a salesman before quitting both to open his own businesses. Then, less than a year after leaving his 2-block hometown, while driving up Sunset Boulevard, he had stopped to pick up a long-haired hitchhiker and was wowed to learn that he was transporting a famous musician. Dennis had invited him into the house, and he'd been practically living there ever since. I asked Charles about his businesses. Wigs, he said. He sold hair pieces from a beach house in Malibu. He didn't tell me that he supplemented his income by dealing marijuana and lightweight drugs. I figured the wig business would be cut short. He was so personal he could have sold homes, cars, magazines, or anything but wigs on Southern California beaches. He was politely aggressive, interested in girls, and ultra-confident, even with the aw shucks guffaw. He wore the thrill of victory like wings on his head. This Hollywood he'd always heard about was the destination of dreams. Not that he wanted to be a celebrity. Just being in the same house with one was not much short of meeting God. Charles at root was a church-nurtured Methodist from that wide strap of the southern U.S. that used to be called the Bible Belt. Imagine his surprise on meeting the weed-smoking, LSD advocate, Methodist minister who was living in Dennis's guest house. Preacher Dean's new faith had blessed him with a beatific smile. His full white beard and ministerial history lent him influence as a psychedelic spiritual guide. But it was a reputation that had got him into trouble in Northern California, where he had legal charges pending. During the next months, he made several trips north to court, sometimes with Charles, and once brought back a car full of college-aged kids, thinking they might stay at the ranch. Since ranch visitors already included horseback riders, an ex-policeman, former ranch hands, and hippies, we directed his passengers to the spiral staircase house. One of them insisted upon returning and had to be accommodated. That was Brooks. He was quietly persistent, but he didn't quite fit in.